He was just a poor farmer who spent years living alone, fighting for every piece of bread. The hill at the edge of his land seemed useless, dead soil, until one day he decided to clear it. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments which country you're watching from. The first light of dawn crept slowly over the hills of New Mexico, washing the rugged landscape in a pale gold that failed to warm the chill of early morning. The wind wandered aimlessly through the dry sagebrush, stirring clouds of dust along the parched ground and whispering through the tired wooden fences that marked the boundaries of a life lived by routine. The earth here was old and stubborn, cracked open in long, jagged lines as though thirst had carved wounds into its surface. Far from the noise and comfort of towns, the desert plains stretched endlessly toward the horizon, vast and unforgiving, where silence was not the absence of sound, but a presence in itself, thick enough to feel against the skin. In the middle of this quiet expanse stood a modest farm, aging and worn like a pair of hands that had labored too long without rest. Its owner, Alex Morgan, emerged from the creaking doorway of his home, his boots scuffing against the sandy ground as he made his way toward the small herd of chickens pecking lazily at the yard. His body moved with the slow steadiness of someone who had performed the same task for decades, leaving little room for surprise or hesitation. His face, tanned and lined from years beneath the unforgiving sun, revealed nothing beyond a quiet determination. His hair, touched by silver, curled beneath the brim of his dusty hat. Everything about him spoke of endurance, of a man molded by the land he worked. Alex had lived his entire life in this place. His grandfather had built the first shack on this patch of property, and his father had expanded it into a functioning farmstead. Now it was Alex who kept it alive, though barely. Every wall bore the story of a family that refused to leave the soil from which they drew their existence. Every plank of wood creaked like a memory too heavy to forget. Alex treated the home and the land not as possessions, but as obligations, inherited responsibilities he could not dishonor, even if the effort drained the best years of his life. Running a farm alone was never what he dreamed of as a boy, but dreams were luxuries for those who had choices. When his parents passed, his mother first, taken quietly in her sleep, and his father years later after a lingering illness, there had been no one else to tend to the livestock, no one else to coax harvests from the stubborn ground. The neighbors had offered sympathy, but none had offered a future. Alex accepted the weight of the farm because letting go felt worse than struggle. His parents had given everything they had to these acres, and he, in turn, gave the same. There was comfort in repetition. Each day began before sunrise, when the sky was still wrapped in darkness and the cold clung to his bones. He would heat a tin of coffee over the small stovetop while the house creaked and sighed, as if waking reluctantly. The taste was bitter, but he did not mind it. He fed the chickens, checked the fencing for damage from the restless wind, filled the trough for Samson, the aging mule who had been his companion longer than most people in his life. Though Samson was slow now and showed his years in stiff movements and drooping ears, he greeted Alex with a grunt that felt more like a conversation than the farmer's rare human interactions. Some mornings, Alex walked the fields to inspect the rows of stubborn crops that fought to survive the dry climate. He knew every inch of the land that he had plowed, nurtured, and leaned upon to survive. Yet there was a part of his property that he never visited, a reminder of frustration and resignation that loomed just beyond the fertile soil. To the east stood a small hill, a lumpy rise in the landscape dotted with thorny brush and sharp-edged stones. Nothing grew there, and nothing ever had. His father once tried to break ground on that hill, believing perhaps that luck could be dug from the earth if the shovel struck deep enough. But the hill resisted all attempts, and eventually it became an empty mark on the map of Alex's life present, but avoided, seen but dismissed as a useless scar. Every morning Alex's gaze drifted toward the hill, as if his eyes were drawn by habit or curiosity he refused to acknowledge. He would stare for a moment, searching for something undefined, before shaking his head and returning to tasks that at least promised tangible results. The hill was barren stone, a waste of time that he did not have. Yet even in its silence it seemed to watch him back, a steady, patient presence that needed no voice to be heard. Living alone had taught Alex the art of silence. Words were scarce, save for when he made the occasional trip into town for supplies, or when a neighbor stopped by with polite conversation. Even then, he said little. He had learned long ago that some people spoke only to hear their own voices, while he found peace in listening. The land did not speak in sentences, but it communicated in other ways. A shift in the wind before a storm, the sudden stillness of birds when a predator lurked nearby, the way the soil cracked to warn of drought. Alex understood these signs better than he understood most people. There was honesty in nature that he never questioned. Yet for all that peace, there were nights when loneliness pressed on him harder than the summer heat. After chores were done and darkness swallowed the farm, he sometimes lingered by the window, staring into the quiet emptiness that stretched away from his home. Memories flickered through his mind, watching his father mend fences with confident hands, hearing his mother humming softly as she cooked supper. Those sounds and sights had once been ordinary, everyday miracles. Now they lived only as echoes, and Alex held them close, unwilling to let time bury them beneath the dust that gathered on everything else. Still, a question gnawed quietly inside him, one he never dared shape into words. Was all his effort and sacrifice building something meaningful, or merely delaying the collapse of a life that was destined to fade? As the sun climbed higher each day, the land baked under the relentless heat, and Alex bent his back to the labor that refused to lighten. He patched worn-out boots himself rather than buy new ones. His clothes were mended so many times that they were more thread and determination than fabric. Meals were simple: eggs, bread, beans, vegetables when the harvest permitted, all prepared with the efficiency of someone who cooked to survive, not to savor. Money was scarce and debts were constant companions. But Alex moved forward anyway, guided by a sense of duty stronger than any fear of failure. In the evenings, when his muscles ached with the weight of the day, he would sit on the front steps, letting the fading sunlight soak into his skin. The western horizon blazed with color, and for a moment the barren land looked almost beautiful, as if painted by a generous hand. That was when the hill appeared most like a contradiction, dark, stubborn, refusing to reflect the beauty that touched everything else. It stood apart, a shadow even in daylight, and Alex sometimes felt that its silence hid more than simple infertility. It seemed to contain a question that he was not prepared to answer. But tonight, as on so many nights before, he refused to dwell on it. He brushed the dust from his trousers, stood, and walked inside to the narrow bed that waited for him. Sleep would come, as it always did, without dreams or excitement. Tomorrow would be another day, much like the ones before. A repetition of movement and labor that kept him going, but gave little promise of change. He lay down staring at the ceiling beams worn smooth by time, and closed his eyes to silence the thoughts that crept in when the world grew still. The wind outside shifted, swirling around the house, and carrying with it grains of sand that tapped softly upon the windows. It brushed over the hill as well, stirring pebbles and tangling itself in clutching thorns. The land seemed restless, unsettled by something unseen. But Alex heard none of it. He slept as he always did, unaware that beneath the surface of that ignored hill lay a secret older than his family, older than the farm, older perhaps than the history written in books. The earth had chosen its moment carefully, waiting for the right time and the right heart to uncover what had been forgotten. And soon the quiet monotony of Alex Morgan's life would crack open like the parched ground after rain. The hill he had dismissed for so long would no longer tolerate being ignored, and the land he thought he knew would reveal a truth that would reshape everything he believed about his purpose, his past, and the destiny that had been slowly guiding his every step. He did not yet know it, but the stillness of his world was nearing its end. The land had begun to stir, and the first tremor of change was already moving beneath his feet. The next morning rose like any other, with the chill of dawn clinging to the windows and the muted glow of sunrise stretching slowly across the worn wooden floorboards of Alex Morgan's home. He awoke before the alarm clock had reason to ring. Long years of habit pushed him into motion, even when his mind had not fully returned from sleep. He dressed in silence, as always, moving through the familiar rhythm of morning, pulling on the same pair of faded jeans, buttoning his work shirt with calloused fingers, tightening the belt that had been notched further and further as the years trimmed him down with labor rather than age. The coffee pot hissed its usual protest as it heated over the stove, and the bitter aroma filled the small kitchen like an unspoken promise of endurance. Outside, Samson paced the corral with slow determination, his hooves kicking up dust from ground that had forgotten the memory of fresh rain. The chickens scattered at Alex's approach, clucking their annoyance before resuming the endless hunt for scraps. The air was crisp, and although the desert sun promised a dry and unforgiving heat later in the day, the morning still held a quiet gentleness. There was nothing in the dawn sky, nothing in the wind, nothing in the restless sounds of the yard to warn Alex that life was about to shift beneath his feet. He worked along the boundary of his field after breakfast, walking the uneven fence line to check for breaks where jackrabbits or coyotes might slip through. His thoughts were occupied by simple concerns: how much feed he had left for Samson, whether the next shipment of seed would arrive before the planting window closed, the ache in his lower back that had been nagging him for days. The routine was so ingrained that his hands moved without conscious command, reaching to tighten wires and replace loose nails while his thoughts drifted to the day's labor ahead. Yet even as he tried to remain focused, something within him tugged at his awareness, subtle but insistent. It wasn't a sound or a sight, but a tension, like a faint vibration in the air that prickled against the back of his neck. He paused, lacing his fingers through the top rail of the fence and scanning the horizon. Nothing moved except dust spiraling over the dry soil. Nothing unusual met his eyes. But the sensation did not fade. It lingered, gnawing gently at the edges of his perception. He shook it off with a sigh and turned toward the smaller patch of land he had set aside for fall planting. The soil there was stubborn after months without moisture, so he worked steadily to loosen it. The sun, now climbing fully above the horizon, beat down with increasing intensity, warming his shoulders and drawing sweat from his brow. He leaned into the effort, letting the rhythm of the shovel soothe his thoughts into silence. Then it came, a sound, faint but unmistakable, a dull metallic note buried deep beneath the ground. The shovel froze mid-swing, and Alex straightened abruptly, the muscles in his arms stiffening as he held his breath. For a long moment he listened, but only heard the rustling of the wind across the brittle plants and Samson's distant snort of discontent. He told himself he had imagined it, the echo of metal ringing inside strained muscles. He adjusted his grip on the shovel and prepared to swing again. The sound returned, louder this time, still muted by earth, but clear enough that his heart responded with a quick, startled beat. It was the sort of noise that should not exist beneath soil, not stone shifting, not root cracking, but something crafted by hands and time. A feeling of unease slithered through his spine. He turned his head slowly toward the eastern hill. The distance between them was modest. He could walk there in under 10 minutes. But somehow that hill had always felt like a world apart, unreachable, unwelcome. Now the land seemed determined to draw him closer. The chickens, unaware of his growing discomfort, continued their anxious scratching at the earth. But Samson had frozen completely, ears pinned forward, eyes trained directly at the hill. His nostrils flared, and he stamped his hoof with agitation. The animal sensed something, a threat or a change, and animals never lied about such warnings. Alex rested his hands on the shovel handle, his breath shallow. He wanted to dismiss the sound as nothing important, some hidden piece of scrap metal or misplaced tool from long ago. The land often resurfaced things the earth no longer wanted, but there was something about the metallic echo, something deliberate, that refused to be ignored. He debated whether to investigate right away or to finish his work first. His practical nature insisted that the hill had waited a decade without him. Surely it could wait another hour. Yet the pull in his chest said otherwise. It was a sensation he barely recognized, a mixture of curiosity and dread interwoven, like fibers in a single thread. He wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand and set the shovel aside. Each step toward the hill felt heavier than the last, as though he was walking against the flow of a river, invisible to the eye, but undeniable in pressure. His boots sank slightly into the looser earth near the base of the hill, and the terrain quickly turned rough. Sharp stones and thorns gnawed at his legs with each step, as if the land itself resisted his intrusion after long years of neglect. But something else urged him forward, a summons, ancient and silent, rising from below. By the time he reached the slope, Samson let out a loud, distressed bray from the distance. Alex paused to glance back. The mule stood rigid, eyes wide with unmistakable fear, head thrown high as though warning him not to continue. The uneasy partnership between man and land, so long balanced, felt suddenly precarious. He turned back toward the hill, swallowed his hesitation, and continued climbing. The higher he went, the more the earth beneath his feet felt disturbed, as if recently churned or shifted without visible explanation. The dust here wasn't baked into hard clods but lay loose and granular, ready to collapse under pressure. Alex crouched and ran his fingers through it, and the soil parted easily, slipping between his fingers like fine sand. He retrieved a small spade from the tool belt around his waist and began digging at a spot where the earth seemed especially restless. At first, the spade sliced through soil effortlessly, revealing deeper layers of compacted dirt and small rocks. Then abruptly, the spade struck something firm and unyielding, sending a tremor up his hand that made him wince. Metal. The same metal that had called to him below the fields. His pulse quickened. He expanded the hole carefully, pushing dirt aside with increasing urgency as curiosity overshadowed caution. The smooth edge of an object began to emerge, rounded, cold, streaked with rust. It was larger than he expected. A thrill and fear tangled tightly in his chest as he continued clearing around it, sweating from more than just the heat. Soon enough, the outline of a small metal chest revealed itself, buried deliberately, not lost. Someone had placed it here with intention, sealing it beneath the earth of this barren hill for reasons Alex could only guess. He stared at it, momentarily frozen, his breath coming fast and shallow. Instinct screamed danger even as fascination drew him closer. He wiped his palms on his trousers and tightened his grip around the chest's handle. The object resisted at first as though anchored by the weight of secrecy, but with a hard tug he unearthed it from its resting place. The chest was remarkably heavy, far more than it should have been for its compact size. Alex grunted as he adjusted its weight against his hip and began the cautious descent back down the hill. His boots slid on loose gravel, and he nearly stumbled several times, but he clung to the chest with an iron grip, refusing to let it return to its burial. When he reached the base of the hill, sweat soaked through his shirt and his breath rasped in his throat. Samson continued to bray with agitation, pacing in restless circles as if the presence of the chest disturbed him. Even the chickens seemed uneasy, huddling together rather than wandering freely as they usually did. Alex set the chest on the ground for a moment, running a hand across the rusted metal. Strange markings lined its surface, symbols unfamiliar and worn by time. He felt suddenly as though he stood on the edge of something he couldn't name, something immense and irreversible. He lifted the chest again, this time cradling it more carefully. The metal was oddly cold to the touch, despite the beating sun. With each step toward his home, a sense of foreboding grew heavier inside him, contrasting sharply with the weight of hope he had rarely allowed himself to feel. It had been so long since anything disrupted the rhythm of his life, too long since the world surprised him. And yet, as he pushed open the door to his home and carried the chest inside, he knew instinctively that whatever he had just uncovered would not remain silent. The barren hill had spoken once more and would not let him ignore its voice again. The chest sat on the kitchen table like an intruder, its rusted edges cutting a brutal contrast to the worn wood beneath it. Dust from the hill still clung stubbornly to the metal, settling into grooves and etchings that hinted at an unfamiliar past. Alex Morgan stood over it, his hands braced on either side, breathing hard from the exertion of carrying it home. For a long moment, he simply stared. The weight of what he had unearthed pressed against his chest in a way that had nothing to do with its physical heft. It felt as though the quiet world he had spent years upholding now trembled at the brink of change. He walked around the table, testing each angle with his scrutiny, searching for the best approach to understand the object. The house, usually filled only with the faint squeal of settling boards and the whisper of wind against the windows, had become unnervingly still. Even Samson seemed to keep his distance outside, occasionally letting out a restless snort that broke the silence like a question left unanswered. It was as if everything around him lurched into cautious expectation, holding its breath along with him. Alex extended a hand and ran his fingers lightly across the chest's surface. The metal, though crusted with time and neglect, felt impossibly cold, as if it had been resting in the deepest shadows of the earth longer than any weather could warm it. Strange markings traced across the lid symbols worn down, but not erased, their shapes curved and angular in ways that did not resemble any stamping or engraving he recognized. He had lived simply and had not spent much time with books beyond what was necessary for farm accounting and occasional repairs. Yet he knew enough to sense that this chest was something no ordinary farmer would bury, nor even possess. The rational part of him suggested that he leave it alone, cover it again, take it back to the hill and bury it deeper than before. But curiosity, the quiet companion he had suppressed for years under duty and routine, now stirred within him like a heartbeat strengthening after years of faint pulses. A chest buried so deliberately, locked tight, heavy with age, was not something a man simply walked away from. Especially not a man who had spent so long feeling that his life was passing him by without purpose. He poured himself a cup of coffee, but it grew cold on the counter untouched. His eyes remained fixed on the chest, his breath shallow. The minutes stretched, thick and heavy, until the sun slid across the sky and poured its afternoon heat into the kitchen. Still he hesitated, as if waiting for a sign or permission he knew would never come. The sound came again, just as dusk began to fall. Soft at first, like the light tapping of a fingernail on a window pane. Then again, louder, the rhythm unmistakable. A faint knock from somewhere inside the chest. The hair rose along the back of his neck, and every muscle in his body tensed at once. He stepped backward, heart hammering against his ribs, his gaze locked on the metal container as though it might shift or rattle across the table. His first instinct was terror, primal and blinding, an urge to flee that screamed through his veins. His second instinct, equally powerful and even more bewildering, was to stay, to listen, to understand. The knocking did not attempt to seem threatening. If anything, it felt like a signal, a reminder that the chest was not a silent relic, but a vessel containing something that wished to be acknowledged. He swallowed hard, throat tight with fear as he approached again. He placed his palms flat against the sides, pressing down as though the pressure might calm whatever stirred within. The knocking ceased immediately, leaving only the echo of the sound pulsing through his thoughts. Darkness settled swiftly around the house, cloaking the farm in its familiar embrace. Alex lit a single lantern, casting a trembling glow that spilled over the chest and left the corners of the room lurking in thick shadow. The walls, cracked and weathered, seemed to lean inward as though drawn toward the secret poised on the table. Sleep eluded him that night. He lay stiff on his mattress, hands clenched against the thin blanket, every creak of the house sharpening his vigilance. The tapping from the chest returned at intervals, steady, patient, as though the thing inside did not fear time. It continued until exhaustion finally dragged him into brief, restless slumber. In his dreams, Alex did not find rest. Instead, he found fragments, the faint whisper of voices he could not translate, blurred images of figures standing in a barren expanse beneath a strange sky. He saw hands digging into the ground with urgency and reverence, bearing the very chest now perched only yards away. He could not see their faces clearly, but he felt their fear, their desperation, their hope. When dawn broke, he awoke gasping, sweat chilling his skin, despite the warm morning air. The house felt tighter somehow, as though the dreams had seeped out of his mind and pooled invisibly in the corners of the room. The chest sat silently on the table, unmoving, but the tension draped around it like an aura. He knew without understanding why that he could not allow it to remain closed any longer. His hands trembled slightly as he reached into a drawer and retrieved a hammer. The rusted padlock securing the chest felt like an obstacle placed not just by time, but by will. Each swing of the hammer resounded through the quiet house, echoing like thunder trapped inside old wood and plaster. The first blow dented the lock. The second cracked it. The third shattered it completely, sending a sharp metallic clang reverberating across walls that held the past of his family, but none of the meaning contained in this small metal box. He pulled the lock free and let it clatter to the floor. His chest rose and fell quickly, breath shallow but determined. With slow intent, He slid his thumb beneath the edge of the lid and lifted. The hinges resisted for a heartbeat, then creaked open in surrender. The smell of age and earth spilled out first, a scent of dark places untouched by air or light. Inside, layers of folded cloth lay stacked neatly, despite decades underground. The fabric was heavier than any material he recognized, woven with threads of deep reds, ochres, and dark greens. Elaborate patterns adorned the cloth, swirling gracefully in designs that hinted at mountains, celestial shapes, and fierce-winged creatures. He lifted the top cloth, careful despite the trembling of his hands. Beneath it, resting like a heart within ribs, was a large medallion. It emitted a faint gleam even in the dim lantern light, and the metal seemed untouched by rust. The medallion was heavy when he picked it up, pressing down against his palm with the weight of history. The creature engraved upon it commanded attention, an eagle-like form with powerful wings spread wide, talons extended as if mid-flight. But its features blended into those of a wolf-sharp teeth, pointed ears, a gaze focused not on prey, but on some distant truth. Surrounding the creature, delicate circles and curved lines created a frame reminiscent of an ancient map or compass, a symbol guiding the way rather than depicting a destination. Alex's skin prickled as warmth seeped from the medallion into his hand. Not the kind of warmth that came from sunlight or flame. It was different, radiating inward, climbing up his arm like a pulse of energy, awakening something he had not known lay dormant. He almost dropped it in shock, but instinct tightened his grip instead. A sudden wave of dizziness washed over him. The room spun, walls bending inward, floor tilting unevenly beneath his feet. Images flashed once more in his mind, people moving in panic beneath a sky dark with approaching danger. A gathering of hands passing the medallion between them before entrusting it to the soil and to time. Alex stumbled backward, nearly colliding with the wall, but he refused to let the medallion go. Its heat eased slowly into a steady hum, like a heartbeat aligning with his own. His breath returned gradually, though his heart still beat hard enough to shake his chest. He slid down against the wall until he was seated on the worn floorboards, the medallion still clutched in his grasp. He stared at it, struggling to comprehend what force he had just welcomed into his life. He did not think himself a man prone to imagination or superstition. He had built a life on facts, the price of feed, the behavior of crops, the ache of physical labor. But this object defied facts. It challenged every assumption he had made about what the world would allow in the quiet isolation of his farm. It was a reminder that there were histories larger than his lineage, mysteries deeper than the soil he tilled. Alex returned the medallion to the chest gently, noticing now that the bottom of the container was lined with more cloth, as if cushioning something sacred. He did not attempt to examine the significance of every detail, not yet. His mind throbbed with too many questions. What was the purpose of the medallion? Who had buried it and why? Why did it feel alive, as though it remembered more of the world than he ever would? And perhaps the most unsettling thought, why had he been the one to find it? He closed the chest, though he left it unlocked now. The moment the lid shut, the house seemed to exhale, the pressure lifting just enough for him to stand again, but not enough to leave him comfortable. The presence of the chest turned his home into something unfamiliar, as though the walls had shifted slightly to accommodate the immense secret they now sheltered. The sun had risen completely by then, and light streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in slow spirals. Alex leaned his hands against the table, staring down at the chest as dread and awe warred inside him. He knew instinctively that whatever he had awakened could not be undone. The buried voices, the persistent knocking, none of that would allow him to return to the mundane rhythm he had lived before. For the first time in years, the farm no longer felt like a solitary island. Something had found him. Something hidden beneath the earth had called out, and he had answered. And as he stepped away from the chest, unable to look at it any longer without feeling the pull of its presence, a quiet truth settled deep within him like a seed preparing to bloom. His life would never be as still, as simple or as silent as it had been. The hill had given him its secret. Now the cost of knowing would unfold. The day that followed did not begin with the usual sense of calm that Alex Morgan had always associated with his lonely existence. Instead, there was a tension woven into the morning air, a restlessness that seemed to vibrate just beneath the surface of every familiar sound in sight. Though the sun rose with its customary brilliance over the harsh landscape, its light failed to bring comfort. The farmhouse, usually a sanctuary of routine and silence, now felt like a place under watch, as though invisible eyes lingered in the shadows of every corner. Alex tried to go about his chores as he always did, forcing himself into the rhythm that had once brought peace to the monotony of his life. But nothing felt ordinary. His gaze drifted constantly toward the window, where the hill loomed in the distance, its presence no longer passive. He could not stop thinking about the chest and the medallion resting inside it. The memory of the warmth pulsing into his hand lingered on his skin like a brand. The dreams from the night before still clung to his mind as though they had imprinted themselves on his very thoughts. He had seen fear and hope intertwined in the eyes of strangers he had never met, people who had entrusted the medallion to depths they prayed would protect it. He had awoken shaken, feeling as if he had intruded on something sacred. The chest remained on the table, locked only by the weight of its own history. There had been no tapping since sunrise, but its silence felt far more ominous than noise. Alex avoided touching it again, though his attention returned to it with relentless persistence. Samson kept pacing near the fence, pausing every so often to stare at the house, ears pinned back. Even the chickens were more skittish than usual, abandoning their natural curiosity to huddle together near the safety of the coop. It was as if the animals understood what he struggled to admit. The arrival of the medallion had bent the world somehow, nudged it off its proper axis. He stepped outside, hoping fresh air would steady him, but unease followed. The wind, usually indifferent as it swept through the valley, felt purposeful now, pushing at him as though urging him to stay alert. His boots crunched over gravel as he moved through the yard. He examined the fences, tightened a few boards, fed the animals, watered the sparse crops. Each task brought only fleeting distraction. His mind kept circling back to what lay inside his home, heavy with meaning he did not yet understand. When he reached the edge of his field, he noticed something unusual. Footprints. Not his. The marks pressed deep into the dust, larger and heavier than those made by anyone who lived nearby. There was a pattern to them, the same soles repeating in a slow, deliberate path along the perimeter of his land. His pulse quickened. Someone had come in the night. They had walked the length of his property like a predator mapping its hunt. Whoever it was hadn't approached the house, but the implication was clear. They were searching. He crouched down, brushing his fingers lightly over one of the prints, feeling the tension knot in his muscles. These tracks were fresh. They had been made mere hours earlier. His first thought was of the hill. Whoever left these marks might know exactly what he had uncovered. He stood and scanned the landscape, his eyes narrowing as he studied the dusty road leading toward the highway. Nothing broke the horizon except heat rising in shimmering waves. Yet the emptiness felt misleading now, as though danger lurked just out of sight, patient and calculating. By midday, the quiet had grown sharp enough to cut. A truck belonging to one of the neighboring farms rumbled past on the distant dirt road, but even that familiar sight failed to soften his unease. The sound of the engine faded all too quickly, swallowed by the vast openness. Later, as the sun reached its zenith and pressed down with smoldering weight, Alex saw a lone figure approaching from the west. At first it seemed like a simple passerby, a traveler making their way through land that rarely saw strangers. But as the distance shortened, the figure resolved into a young man, someone Alex recognized. The boy, if one could still call him that, was in his early 20s, thin but tall, with a worn backpack slung over one shoulder and a bundle tucked under his arm. His name was Ethan Carter, a drifter known to wander between ranches in search of odd jobs. He had worked for Alex once or twice in past seasons, hauling hay or helping repair a section of roof. He wasn't a troublemaker, but he had an unfortunate talent for gossip, absorbing and spreading information faster than wildfire could race across dry grass. Alex had no issues with the boy before, but today his presence felt like an omen. Ethan waved as he approached, breathless from the walk and wearing a smile that seemed too eager to be natural. Alex greeted him cautiously, trying to read the expression behind the friendliness. Ethan spoke casually about needing work, about how he could help mend fences or clean the barn, anything that needed doing. But Alex could sense there was a question buried beneath the surface, waiting to strike. He motioned toward the house, offering water to the visitor. Ethan thanked him, drinking deeply, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Then he leaned in a little closer than necessary and asked whether Alex had found anything strange on his land recently. The teen tried to sound nonchalant, but his eyes betrayed the hunger for information. The rumor had already begun to spread. Alex's heart hammered against his ribs, yet he kept his voice level as he dismissed the question, offering no information and changing the subject to hay prices in the dry season. Eventually, Ethan accepted the lack of answers and left, though his eyes lingered on the house far too long before he turned to walk away. Alex watched him go, a chill settling deep into his bones. He knew it would not end there. As afternoon descended into evening, a strange stillness fell upon the valley. The wind died entirely. Not even a distant bird cried in the sky. The silence pressed heavy against Alex's ears, so unnatural that he stepped inside the house simply to escape it. But inside felt no safer. The chest's presence was suffocating. Every time Alex passed it, the fine hairs on his arms rose as though brushed by an unseen hand. He could not shake the feeling that the medallion inside watched him, or listened, or waited. He sat at the table staring down at his calloused hands. He tried to reason through his situation, but reason felt too small for such an enormous unknown. He thought about calling the authorities, but what would he tell them? That he had dug up a box with an old piece of metal inside? That he heard knocking coming from within? That strangers were suddenly circling his land? He imagined the skepticism that would color their faces, the insinuation that stress or loneliness had warped his mind. The house creaked, and he nearly jumped. The sun had dipped low enough that shadows stretched long fingers across the floor, reaching toward the chest. He lit a lamp in the kitchen and locked the door, something he rarely bothered to do. As the last light of day gave way to evening, the sense of being watched intensified until it was almost unbearable. He ate little for supper, too on edge to swallow more than a few bites of bread. Darkness thickened outside the windows, and he checked every lock twice before retreating to his bedroom. Sleep, however, refused to come. He lay awake, eyes wide in the blackness, ears straining for the slightest disturbance. The ticking of the old wall clock became a taunt, marking time that stretched thin with dread. Then, sometime deep in the night, he heard footsteps outside, slow, steady, deliberate. His breath caught in his throat, his body freezing beneath the covers. The footsteps circled the house, moving with unhurried precision, pausing near the windows as though whoever was out there was listening. Alex forced himself upright and reached for the baseball bat he kept beside the bed. His pulse roared in his ears as he crept through the house, each step silent on the worn boards. The kitchen was colder now, shadows draped over the chest in a way that made the room feel hostile. Alex pressed his back against the wall, straining to hear through the pounding of his own heart. The footsteps resumed near the back door, then drifted toward the edge of the property. He dared a glance outside through the side window, but saw only the bleaching glow of moonlight on empty ground. After what felt like an eternity, the silence returned. But the damage was done. Someone had come to his home under cover of darkness. Someone who did not knock. Someone who left without a word. Alex did not sleep the rest of the night. Instead, he sat in the kitchen with the bat across his lap and a lantern burning low, his gaze never straying far from the chest. He listened to the wind as it cautiously returned, rustling against the windows like a nervous animal. Every now and then, he closed his eyes, but even then, he could see the medallion glowing in his mind, pulsing like an ember, clinging to life. When the sun finally rose again, he felt no relief. Fatigue weighed across his shoulders like a wet blanket, but adrenaline continued to burn hot beneath it. Outside, he discovered new footprints in the dirt, circling the house just as he had heard. Samson paced behind the fence, ears flicking nervously. Even the chickens appeared tense, their movements jittery and unnatural. By mid-morning, another visitor arrived. A woman from town, someone he knew only in passing, came bearing a basket of warm bread, claiming she had baked too much. But her smile was too proud, her questions too probing. She lingered at the door, peering past him into the shadows of his home, hoping to glimpse something unusual. Alex thanked her with curt politeness and shut the door firmly once she left. With every encounter, the truth became more evident. The land's secret no longer belonged to him alone. Word had spread through the community like thirst through sand, attracting curiosity, greed, and perhaps worse. By afternoon, anxiety gnawed at his sanity. He paced the length of his kitchen, then the hallway, struggling to find a solution. He told himself he should hide the chest elsewhere or bury it again under layers of earth where no one would find it. But a stronger voice whispered that the medallion had not been uncovered by mistake. Returning it to the hill felt wrong, as though he would be betraying something ancient that had chosen him. Why, he still did not know. He came to a single conclusion. He could not lose the medallion. Yet he also could not protect it alone. As fear tightened its grip, a deeper understanding took shape. The medallion was not an object of wealth. It was more than metal and craftsmanship. It was a message or a warning, a legacy entrusted to him in the most unlikely way. That night, as the moon climbed above the horizon once more, Alex stood outside beneath its silver glow. He scanned the surrounding fields, watching for movement, for headlights, for shadows that did not belong. Each rustle in the grass made his skin prickle. Every whisper of wind sent shivers racing up his spine. He realized then that whatever forces he had awakened, they would not allow him to return to his previous life. And the dangers now creeping into his days and nights were not the type a man could simply shut his door against. There was no doubt left in his mind. The hill had revealed a secret meant to be guarded, and somewhere beyond the borders of his land, others were preparing to take it from him. The peace that had once sheltered his home was gone, replaced by the promise of a conflict he could not yet see, but already felt closing in. Morning arrived without granting Alex a single moment of rest. The sleepless night had left his mind clouded and his nerves frayed. But as the sun lifted over the plain and softened the hard lines of the landscape, he forced himself to stand and prepare for whatever the day might bring. His bones ached with exhaustion, yet adrenaline continued to pulse through him, driving his movements with an urgency he did not fully understand. The air carried a strange weight, as if the world itself held back a breath, waiting for him to take the next step toward an unfolding destiny that he had not chosen but could no longer avoid. The chest remained on the table, closed but unlocked, a silent reminder that his life had crossed a threshold from which he could not retreat. The medallion inside seemed to radiate presence, even through the layers of cloth, demanding attention without making a sound. Alex approached it slowly, not because he doubted its significance, but because he feared what might happen if he rushed. He hesitated for a moment, fingers trembling above the lid before finally lifting it just enough to slip his hand inside. The medallion's warmth greeted him instantly, pulsing like a heartbeat, awakening the same energy that had flooded him the day before. He stared at the object as it glimmered faintly in the early light, compelling him to claim it as his own and carry it to where it was meant to be. After securing the medallion around his neck, its weight settling against his chest like a truth he had always been meant to uncover, Alex stepped outside. The farm stretched before him, unchanged in shape yet transformed in aura. The hill, which had once been a forgotten blemish on his land, now seemed to rise with authority, as though it had finally revealed the purpose that had lain dormant within its stones. The winds from the east blew with a new voice, urging him toward the summit. Even Samson quieted his anxious pacing and watched Alex with an intensity that bordered on reverence, as though the mule sensed that the bedrock of their familiar world had shifted. Alex began the walk toward the hill with cautious steps, but each footfall seemed to quicken his pulse, pushing him faster until he climbed without hesitation, as though driven by something older than instinct. The earth beneath his boots had changed. The soil felt softer, pliant, as if it had already accepted his arrival and was ready to reveal what it had kept hidden for so long. His breath deepened, chest rising and falling in rapid patterns, but he did not pause. A strange clarity had settled inside him, washing away doubt and fear. The fatigue that had clung to him throughout the morning dissolved with every stride. He felt guided by the wind, by the land, by the medallion that warmed with increasing intensity as he neared the crest. When he reached the top, the world below him spread out like a canvas brushed with sunlight and shadow, untouched by the turmoil bubbling beneath its surface. The earth emitted a faint hum that vibrated through his bones, a rhythm he recognized not with his ears but with some deeper sense. He knelt, his hands grazing the hardened crust of the hill, until they found the soft patch of soil that marked where the chest had been buried. Beneath that point, the earth seemed hollow, resonating like a chamber awaiting an offering. Alex pressed his palm flat against the spot. The ground responded with a subtle warmth, as though returning recognition. His fingers curled into the soil, scraping away dust and pebbles. The deeper he dug, the clearer the hollow shape became, a cavity that had been crafted deliberately, not by nature, but by hands that had moved centuries before his own. They had carved a resting place meant to receive something of great importance when the moment was right. That moment, he now understood with absolute certainty, had arrived. He reached into his shirt and removed the medallion, cradling it between his hands. The metal glowed faintly, its lines and engravings illuminated by an inner light that had no source in the sun. He lowered it into the cavity, and as soon as the medallion made contact with the hollow space, the earth shifted. Soil moved as if breathing, gently settling into place around the medallion without burying it completely. The symbols etched across the artifact brightened, their glow casting golden reflections across Alex's hands. A sudden tremor rippled through the ground beneath him, not violent, but purposeful. The vibrations pulsed outward in ever-widening circles, as though the hill itself had awakened. Alex steadied himself, heart pounding. The air thickened, swirling with dust and light, and all sound muted except for the strange hum rising from the earth. He closed his eyes, overwhelmed yet unafraid, and then he felt it, voices rising not from around him, but within him. They did not speak in language but in meaning. Their words bypassed the ears and struck directly at the core of his consciousness. He saw images unfold in flashes of memory not his own. He witnessed the lives of people long gone, figures clothed in woven garments adorned with the very symbols embroidered on the chest's ancient cloths. They stood united beneath this same sky, watching warriors from distant lands encroach upon the home they held sacred. He saw them gather at the hill under cover of night, forming a circle around the medallion, whispering oaths of protection and hope into the wind. The medallion's light dimmed as they buried it beneath the earth, entrusting the land itself with the responsibility of safeguarding their heritage. He felt their devotion. He felt their fear. And though he did not know their names, he recognized their strength in the very ground he knelt upon. Their final wish had not been for wealth or power, but for remembrance, a future where their story would not be erased. The medallion held not only the memory of who they were, but the spirit of what they fought to preserve. Alex's breath caught as realization struck with the force of revelation. This was not an artifact to be locked away in a museum or sold as treasure. It was a piece of identity, beating with the history of a people whose existence had been almost swallowed by time. The land had waited, watching generation after generation pass by until it found someone worthy, someone willing to listen. He did not understand why he had been chosen, only that he had. The medallion's power pulsed in rhythm with his heart, forging a bond that felt like centuries compressed into a single instant. He pressed his palm back to the ground, feeling its warmth travel up his arm and settle in his chest with a surety he had not known before. When the vision faded, the world returned to its natural clarity, and the wind resumed its course across the plains. But the change was irreversible. The sky seemed brighter, the hill more alive. As though both acknowledged what had transpired, the medallion's glow softened and dimmed, settling once again into quiet strength. Alex sat back, breathing deeply, letting the enormity of what he had experienced sink into every part of him. He felt no fear now, only purpose. This land, which he had tended for so many years without knowing its story, had chosen him as its guardian. His life, once stripped of meaning beyond survival, had rooted itself in something greater. Yet the moment of solemn peace did not last. Down below, faint shapes began to appear along the outskirts of his property, the silhouettes of vehicles rolling across the dusty road. At first just one, then another, then more. They crawled closer, the sunlight glinting off metal and glass, bringing with them the harsh presence of those who believed that history and legacy could be claimed by possession rather than understanding. Alex recognized the threat instantly. The ones who had been prowling his home under cover of night no longer bothered to hide. The rumor of discovery had grown into a siren call for those consumed by greed. They would come demanding, claiming, forcing. They would think he was a lonely farmer too powerless to resist. But they were wrong. The medallion's weight pressed firmly against his chest once more as he slipped it back beneath his shirt. And in that simple gesture, he felt the strength of every voice that had spoken to him through vision and earth. He no longer stood alone on the barren hill. He stood with the will of a people whose history had refused to die. He descended slowly, one steady step at a time, each movement fueled by conviction instead of fear. Samson watched from the edge of the fence, alert but calm now, as though he sensed the shift inside his owner. The farmhouse loomed ahead, familiar yet transformed by the truth Alex carried. The vehicles halted near his front gate. Doors opened. Men stepped out, strangers in matching dark boots and stern expressions, moving with the confidence of those who believe their authority absolute. They scanned the property with narrow, calculating eyes and seeking where value might lie hidden. Alex reached the bottom of the hill and walked directly toward them. The dust swirled around his boots, the sun catching the lines of his face like chisel strokes carved from determination. He had spent his life tending earth that gave little in return, and yet now that same earth had entrusted him with its most precious secret. He felt pride well up inside him, fierce and unwavering. The strangers would come for the medallion. They would demand explanations and claim rights they did not have. They would try every intimidation, every threat. They would underestimate him. But Alex Morgan, once just a solitary farmer surviving the quiet erosion of days, was now the keeper of a legacy. The hill had tested him and found him worthy. The land had spoken, and he had listened. And as he squared his shoulders, ready to face whatever storm awaited him, one truth resounded within him brighter than fear or doubt. He would not yield. Alex felt the heat of the sun lingering on his shoulders as he approached the cluster of vehicles stationed near his front gate. Dust hung in the air around them, rising and falling in slow, shimmering currents. The men who had emerged from the truck stood with a commanding presence, their expressions set in steeled confidence. They wore dark clothing, sturdy boots, and carried the demeanor of people accustomed to being obeyed rather than questioned. Their eyes tracked him with greedy anticipation, as though he were no longer a man, but merely an obstacle between them and something far more valuable. He continued forward without changing pace. His hands remained at his sides, his posture straight and grounded. He felt the medallion beneath his shirt, its weight pressing against his heart with reassuring steadiness. Every step he took reminded him of the visions he had seen, the people who had trusted the earth to protect their legacy, the lives entwined with the very land beneath his boots. His purpose, once uncertain, now moved through him like a current of iron, sharpening his resolve. One of the men stepped ahead of the others, his broad shoulders and sharp gaze marking him as the leader. His voice was smooth but cold as he declared that they had reason to believe Alex had found something significant on his property. Something that, according to them, he was not permitted to keep. They pressed forward with claims of legal authority, insinuations of government ownership, and vague threats of consequences should he fail to comply. They spoke as though their words alone could bend the will of the landholder before them. Alex listened, silent and impassive. He said nothing. Their assumptions rolled off of him like dust off a stone. He knew better than to reveal panic or anger. If the medallion had chosen him, then fear had no place at his side. The men mistook his silence for hesitation and sharpened their tone, insisting that he allow them to search his property immediately. The threat in their demand was unmistakable. But Alex stood firm, his feet planted in soil that belonged to him by years of toil and roots of lineage. He told them calmly, without raising his voice, that there was nothing for them to take from his home. His refusal struck them like insult. They stepped closer, the aggression in their movements rising. Yet Alex did not retreat. The wind picked up suddenly and swept between them, carrying with it the dry scent of earth and sage. It curled around Alex like a warning, or perhaps like support. Either way, the men noticed it too, and exchanged glances among themselves, unsettled by a shift in the air they could not explain. The leader took another step forward, preparing to assert force where intimidation had faltered. But as he did, Alex raised his chin and met the man's eyes fully. There was no defiance in his expression, only certainty. The kind that unsettles even the powerful, because it comes from a place deeper than authority or fear. Alex told the man, in a voice steady as the land itself, that this soil trusted him, that he would not allow them to harm what it guarded. The confrontation hung suspended for a long moment that seemed to stretch impossibly. Eventually, perhaps sensing that escalation here would cost them more than they anticipated, the strangers stepped back with frustrated stares. They vowed to return with greater power behind them and then retreated into their vehicles. Engines roared to life, kicking up clouds of dust as they drove away, retreating but not defeated. Alex stood for a while after they disappeared beyond the horizon, listening as silence reclaimed the valley. His breath eased from his lungs, but tension still clung to him. He knew this was not over. He knew they would come back, and next time they would return not with requests or warnings, but with force. He turned toward the farmhouse, scanning the land with new eyes. His solitude was broken. His days of being invisible to the world had ended the moment he opened the chest. As the sun fell behind the hills and shadows lengthened across the fields, Alex returned to his home. The medallion glowed faintly beneath his shirt, as if reacting to the tension woven into the air. Inside the house, he sat with the artifact resting in his palms once more. He studied its details as though committing them to memory. Every etched feather and line now felt clearer. Filled with meaning, he was on the cusp of understanding. The chest that had once seemed menacing now looked like a vessel of purpose, a reminder that he was now a steward of history rather than just a keeper of land. As night settled, he knew another sleepless stretch awaited him. He lit a lantern and sat by the window, gripping the medallion tightly as he watched the road for any returning headlights. But no vehicles came. Instead, the world outside his window grew calm under the blanket of stars. Stillness spread across the fields in slow waves. Even Samson finally rested, swishing his tail lazily beneath the moonlight. Alex listened closely, feeling the beat of the earth beneath his floorboards as if the land itself was breathing alongside him. Fatigue eventually softened his vigilance. His eyelids grew heavy and his head bowed forward. But he did not drift into restless nightmare as he had the nights before. Instead, something gentle washed over him, a sense of being held rather than haunted. He felt warmth rise from the medallion into his palms, traveling through his arms and settling over his heart like a shield. The lantern flame flickered softly, casting golden reflections across his face. Then came the voices again, not as fragmented whispers or fearful warnings, but as a chorus of memories fused into clarity. The land spoke, guiding him through what had once been buried in shadow. He saw entire generations living in harmony with the earth, cultivating not dominance but unity. They thrived not because they conquered, but because they listened. They cherished the soil as a living ancestor, the sky as a protector, the wind as messenger. They honored their origins by honoring the ground they walked upon. He saw their struggle when invaders arrived from distant territories, driven by greed and hunger for domination. Those ancient protectors hid the medallion because it symbolized their identity, their truth. They knew if it fell into hands blinded by ambition, their legacy would be erased, their story stolen. They trusted the land to choose when the world was ready to remember them again, when their lineage could be safeguarded not through war, but through wisdom. The vision slowed, then faded into darkness. The medallion's warmth ebbed, leaving Alex in a deep stillness. He woke with a sudden inhale, though he wasn't sure when exactly he had fallen asleep. The lantern's flame had nearly died out, leaving only soft illumination. Hours had passed like a single heartbeat, but he did not rise in panic. He rose with calm certainty. When he walked to the porch, the horizon glowed with the first traces of morning, and the sight that greeted him sent a tremor of awe through his entire being. The hill that had once appeared barren, a lifeless scar in the landscape, now shimmered with new growth. Tiny sprouts broke through soil that had long refused to yield, stretching upward with vibrant green hope. Dew glistened upon them like blessings. The transformation was modest but undeniable. Something dormant had awakened. He stared at the hill in silent amazement. The earth had responded not with violence, but with revival. It was the first sign, humble yet profound, that the unveiling of the medallion did not portend only danger. It also carried the promise of restoration. Later that day, the peace that had settled over the farm rippled outward. The vehicles did not return. Instead, a convoy of different nature arrived, a research team escorted by civil authorities and led by a woman whose posture carried empathy rather than force. She introduced herself as Dr. Evelyn Hayes, a historian who had spent years searching for the very artifact now safe against Alex's heart. She spoke with sincerity and knowledge, revealing what he had already seen through visions, that the medallion represented the enduring legacy of a culture nearly erased by time and conquest. She insisted that the medallion belonged to its people, not to museums or powerful organizations. She commended Alex for guarding it, even without knowing its story. Her voice contained a reverence seldom heard in modern speech recognition that history was not a commodity, but a living bond. Alex listened carefully. He asked nothing in return except assurance that the artifact would remain where its meaning thrived, in the land that birthed it. Dr. Hayes agreed without hesitation. She proposed that the hill and its surroundings be protected, not as private property, but as a community sanctuary where locals and visitors could learn, remember, and honor the origin of the medallion. She promised protection from those who sought only to exploit. A meeting was soon held in the small town nearby. Neighbors who had once eyed Alex with suspicion now embraced him with pride. Officials who had never acknowledged his existence now thanked him publicly for his stewardship. The whispers of rumor transformed into stories told with admiration. The land that had once isolated him now connected him to people he never thought would stand beside him. Weeks passed. Life changed but also returned to its old pace. Alex rose with the dawn each day, feeding Samson and tending to his fields. But there was new life sprouting on the hill, a field of green stretching across what was once dry and barren. The farm, once defined by quiet survival, now thrived with purpose. Visitors sometimes arrived, guided by respect rather than curiosity, listening as Alex told them of patience, of sacrifice, and of what could emerge when one chose to trust rather than abandon. On a calm evening, he stood outside his home, gazing toward the hill. The medallion and the claws that had once protected it now rested securely within a display built on the hill's summit, safeguarded beneath glass but still close to the soil that had birthed it. Alex placed his hand over his chest, feeling the absence of its weight, yet sensing that nothing within him had been lost. The bond remained. He stayed there as the sky deepened from violet to indigo, and the stars blinked awake above the land that had given him everything he needed to rediscover himself. He lifted his eyes to the constellations and felt his soul fill with something he had never dared to hope for. Not triumph, not reward, but belonging. His gaze lowered to the hill one last time before he stepped inside. There was no longer fear within him, no longer emptiness or despair. His solitude had become guardianship, his sacrifice transformed into legacy. Alex Morgan, once a farmer forgotten by the world, now stood as the protector of a history stronger than conquest and louder than silence. And as he closed the door behind him, he understood the truth the land had been whispering all along. Even the most overlooked soil can hold a story powerful enough to reshape the future. A forgotten hill can become a source of life, and a man who once lived unseen can become eternal through the legacy he chooses to guard. Don't miss what's coming next. Subscribe now and stay with us for more unbelievable stories. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. See you in the next one.